Julian Cadman, Bruno Gallotta, Luca Russo. These are the names that we should remember. The names of people who were murdered by a bunch of sickening, knuckle-dragging losers. The Barcelona terrorists who, you know, in one of the last acts in their lives, mowed down a load of people. They want to be remembered, don't they? As martyrs, as soldiers. When we splash their faces on the news bulletins and on the front pages of newspapers, then that helps them win. That incentivises them. Because they think that their last acts, murdering a load of innocent people, kids, elderly people, whoever they can kill indiscriminately, that they'll be venerated and they'll always be remembered. They'll have that notoriety, but that won't happen. It shouldn't happen anyway. They should just be allowed to fester on the scrap heap of history. The people we should remember, of course, are those who died, about what they meant to their loved ones, about their achievements. We do need to have, always, a debate about terrorism. And that means looking at all the factors that are involved in terrorism. And sometimes this debate is a bit simplistic, isn't it? You know, it's caricatured. It's this idea that either it's just an ideology which perverts and twists Islam in order to justify the slaughter of innocent people, or it's just about foreign policy, about the consequences of Western intervention. Actually, it's more complex than that. Of course it is. And the factors for each terrorist attack, the factors behind each terrorist all differ. We know that many terrorists have a background of mental distress. We know that many of them come from families that aren't even religious, including non-believers, and are radicalised online. We know many of them have a history of alcohol and drug abuse. We know many of them have a history of violence against women. These are all factors which you have to look at and examine to understand what radicalises some rather than others. And yes, of course, that includes the consequences of calamitous Western invasions of Iraq and Libya, which have turned them into these terrorist-infested hellholes in many cases. But there's one thing we do need to talk about far more, and that is the role of Western allies, most notably Saudi Arabia, in exporting an ideology which is a threat to the national security of this country, of many other countries, both in the Middle East and in Europe and the United States. Saudi Arabia is a vicious, murderous dictatorship. It beheads people. It chops the heads off people for being gay. It beheads them for being dissidents. It treats women in the most abominable way possible, stripping them of the most basic civil rights imaginable. There are no democratic elections, no independent political parties or trade unions. It is a vicious totalitarian state. Now, I've spoken repeatedly, including on this channel, about the Saudi bombing of Yemen. I went to a refugee camp in Djibouti where I met kids who have fled a sickening war which has claimed the lives of thousands, which has plunged Yemen into a humanitarian crisis, and British bombs we give to the Saudi head-chopping tyrants, are being dropped on Yemen, killing thousands of people. We saw what happened in the 1980s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, Western states backed those fighting against the Soviets, who were jihadis. Islamist extremists from across the world converged on Afghanistan, and you had growing radicalisation. Now, what you saw there was Saudi-exported Wahhabi extremism merged with the tribal codes of the Pashtun tribes of Afghanistan, and that fusion helped create what became the Taliban. No Saudi Arabia, no Al-Qaeda. Those forms of millenarial, apocalyptic death cults, the seeds were planted by the Saudis in terms of what was exported by, Saudi elite figures and the Saudi establishment, and as well as that, prominent individuals, influential individuals who were able to fund and support many of those groups in Afghanistan and elsewhere. As the Chatham House professor Paul Stevens put it, for a long time there was an unwritten agreement whereby Al-Qaeda's presence was tolerated in Saudi Arabia, but don't piss inside the tent, piss outside. As a leaked US State Department memo put it, the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide comes from Saudi donors. Radical Salafists across the Middle East receive ideological and material backing from within the Saudi kingdom. Then there's Qatar. Another leaked US memo said that the Qatari and Saudi regimes are providing clandestine financial and logistical support to ISIS and other radical groups in the region. What we're talking about is powerful individuals within Qatar who are able to export support funding for these groups. Then there's Kuwait. Look, in the early 90s, of course, there was the Gulf War, where Western forces were involved in that war to clear Iraqi forces from Kuwait with terrible bloodshed, it has to be said, and setting in motion a series of calamities which we're still paying the consequences for. Now, Kuwait remains a dictatorship which lacks freedom of expression and basic civil rights, but critically, hundreds of millions of pounds have been channeled through supposed charities via Kuwait to extremist groups. Back in 2014, an associate fellow at Chatham House said to me, high-profile Kuwaiti clerics were quite openly supporting groups like Al-Nusra using TV programmes in Kuwait to grandstand on it. So yeah, we need a proper wide-ranging debate about terrorism. Of course we need perspective. The vast majority of victims of these terrorists are Muslims in the Middle East. In the United States, since 9/11, twice as many deadly terrorist attacks have been committed by the far right, rather than Islamist terrorists. We've just had a fascist attack in the United States, which injured dozens and of course killed one American anti-fascist protester. And we also, of course, need to bear in mind overall that significantly more people were dying of terrorism back in, say, the 70s than they are today. But it is a real risk, of course it is. So it's a threat that exists, and we need a proper discussion and debate about how we stop it. And one of those factors is confronting brutal, murderous regimes that we support. We arm them. When the Saudi dictator died, what did this government do, the Conservative government? Lowered Britain's flag to half-mast to mourn the passing of a human rights abusing despot. And the British government, under Theresa May, is refusing to publish a report which looks at extremism and foreign funding of its terrorists. Undoubtedly, as the likes of Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, has pointed out.
Because the contents of the report will embarrass the government's friends in Saudi Arabia.
Because it would expose the role of their allies in the funding of international extremism and terrorism. We need a proper wide-ranging debate and discussion about how we actually tackle, yes, this ideology, this extremism, which the close allies of the West, including Britain, are directly exporting, threatening, menacing the lives of people all over the Western world. Our government and the governments of the West have blood on their hands because they are directly complicit by being in league with extremist, terrorism exporting states. I actually think there could be a bit of unity on this one. Whether you position yourselves on the right or the left of politics, I think there's an increasing awareness of the threat of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states which our governments are allied with and are supporting. So how can we tackle them? How can we build a coalition, if you like, which can take on these regimes and the ideologies that they are exporting? So please leave your thoughts, as ever, leave your comments, subscribe. I'll see you next time.